So there was an interesting article that came up on the Warzone on the drive not too long ago, and I've been wanting to talk about it, but I also have been sick. So you'll hear me cough a little bit throughout this, but I'm going to try my best not to isolate them and cut them where I can. But this is an interesting idea. And basically, the concept is taking the Warthogs, the A-10Cs the U.S. Air Force has, retiring those, but replacing them with Super Hornets, particularly the EF Block 3s. Now, this was written by Patrick Burt Brown, who is an A-10 weapons instructor, and, well, the headline is obviously kind of the Super Hornets' big grabbing thing, but the main point of the article is not necessarily that, and we'll talk about it more in a moment. But there are a couple of different videos and video series you can watch to get some more reference points for the A-10, the Super Hornet, in this particular article. So the first three there for the A-10 with Laser Pig, Task and Purpose, and Mega Projects. Then for the F-18, you have Pilot Photog and Dark Skies, with Pilot Photog doing a series pretty much beginning prototype to current Block 3 Super Hornets. And then the Ready Room had like a little clip from, I assume, like a podcast talking about this article. And the basic idea is, of course, replacing the A-10Cs with the FA-18 EF Block 3s, but not necessarily because the plane, like he doesn't say that the plane doesn't work or doesn't fit the role, but it's largely to keep the Forward Air Controller Airborne skill set alive. A lot of other aircraft have kind of dropped this, and the Super Hornet presents an opportunity to keep this skill set going in case we need it in the future. And we'll talk more about what that skill set really entails, but basically it's a forward air controller in the air. It's someone whose like sole job is just coordinate everything in the airspace, and having a someone in a combat aircraft in the actual situation kind of helps that. And then, of course, he kind of rounds things out with looking at the future conflicts the U.S. may become involved in, and kind of the need for close air support missions in those situations. So China, Taiwan, and Korea are kind of the big ones. So let's take a look at the A-10C and the FA-18E and F. Now, this is the E variant, if I'm correct, for the F-18. But the empty weight for the A-10C is just under 25,000 pounds, with the empty weight for the Super Hornet being just over 32,000. Now, if you look at the max takeoff weight of the A-10C, it's 46,000 pounds, with the Super Hornet coming in at 66,000 there. The A-10C does have a longer loiter time, but has a lower fuel capacity. Part of that is the just straight wing design, that, you know, it better facilitates being around over speed, as we'll see in a second. But the fuel capacity with external fuel tanks or conformal fuel tanks for the Super Hornet does close that gap fairly, pretty close, and aerial refueling capabilities and stuff. Now, in terms of max speed, obviously, is going to be really the big factor here, with the A-10 maximizing its speed at about 440 miles an hour, usually cruising around 340, and its stall speed, kind of the slowest you're being able to fly with this, 138. So you're not ever really going that slow unless you're stalling or trying to land or something. But it does mean that this airframe is very comfortable at low speeds and typically low altitudes. Whereas the Super Hornet, which has a higher service ceiling, I think, or at least more regularly, has a maximum speed of just under 1,200 miles an hour, which is about Mach 1.6. Cruise speed and stall speed for this aircraft vary significantly because their loadouts can change a lot. But around 770 miles an hour, 777. In a stall speed, I've seen variations anywhere from like as low as 132 to upwards of like 150, 160. So once again, depends on the loadout, but generally speaking, as far as the inventory of the U.S. aircraft, or just U.S. combat aircraft rather, the Super Hornet kind of can emulate the A-10. Now, kinematically, they're very different, obviously, but the big leading edge on the Super Hornet does help it control better at slower speeds. So you do get a little bit of a benefit out of that. And then you have the different engines, of course, the A-10 rocking the GE TF34 GE 100A turbofan engines with just over 9,000 pounds of thrust each, with 2 of those bad boys. And the Super Hornet's going to have 2 General Electric F414-400 turbofan engines with 13,000 pounds of thrust each, with 22,000 pounds with afterburner, and both have 11 hardpoints. Now, of course, the A-10's going to have a bigger gun, but the A-18 also still has a gun, just not as big, not as big and crazy sounding. So, the big point of the article outside of the Super Hornet was the Forward Air Controller Airborne role. And basically, this is the guy who is usually like the second seat. You can kind of see his little arm sticking out back there. Who is just doing that, right? He's in a combat aircraft, but he is coordinating with boots on the ground or intermediaries, depending on. He helps control airspace, so is looking at different tasking for different aircraft, his own aircraft, seeing what other assets are in the area to get munitions onto whatever target has been identified by the ground forces, and generally just target identification. Now, if you've watched Laserpig's video on the A-10, this has been something the A-10 has struggled with. And kind of close air support, when you're close, this is a fairly common situation that targeting pods help this, but it's really difficult, especially, back with Gulf War era stuff, to be able to identify a target from, like, normal altitudes that these aircraft will fly. Now, of course, a lot of advancements have come through, and with interconnectivity between drones, ground assets, lightning targeting pods, all that, it is easier. And having someone in the AO to be able to really dictate that to everybody is pretty significant. So this is a very important role from Burt Brown's perspective. And, it makes a lot of sense, but a lot of the other aircraft squadrons in the USAF have kind of backed off from this, right? They leave tasking to another separate group. They don't have someone on site with them basically doing all of this. Now, from my understanding, A-10s have this capability, or are more used to working with this type of situation. The Marines do this pretty regularly, and that's kind of it. So, we'll kind of see how things play out in the future if this is a thing, but that was really the big... We need an aircraft to help facilitate this role more so than anything, and the Super Hornet just kind of happened to be like the most interesting option as far as fitting what the A-10 was capable of. Now, this isn't mentioned in the article, but this was the first thing I thought of when I saw this, was this would keep Boeing's Super Hornet production line active as well. Currently, Boeing is set to shut down that production line in the end of 2025, or somewhere in 2025, but I think they said the end of 2025. And this is something I've kind of struggled with as far as going back and forth on whether or not this would actually be a beneficial thing to happen. Because, yeah, having Super Hornet production lines in working order is great, especially if something comes up. And, I've been a fairly big proponent on this channel of the Super Hornet as far as competitions in other countries. But a lot of this type of stuff gets to the argument, but what if we need it, right? We need to keep it active just in case. And Congress has done this before, where they will procure something that really doesn't fit a role super well in order just to keep the production lines active in case they need it for whatever the main purpose was that they're already using it for. So I wouldn't be horribly shocked if maybe they do this in low numbers, but this would still be a stretch. And, well, defense spending is like one of the few things that most people on Capitol Hill can kind of agree on, unfortunately. This still seems like a bit of a stretch. Now, as far as the actual FA-18, the Block 3 in particular, why was this the option he picked, right? Because this is for the U.S. Air Force, keep in mind, that operates no... well, I think there were some talks that possibly they might operate some Growler squadrons at some point, because I think the Navy was trying to kind of slowly phase those out a little bit or reduce the number they had. But currently they operate no Super Hornet variants of any type. So, particularly, he brings this up because the F model is a two-seater, so you would have the capability of having that forward air controller in that back seat. The Block 3 is also going to give you better identification capabilities, better electronic systems, conformal fuel tanks to kind of help combat that loiter time situation. And then it has the same number of weapon stations that the A-10 has. So, with this being multi-role, it can fulfill that ground attack and close air support mission set. But, once again, this is a very different beast than the A-10. And once again, while he didn't mention it, it does keep the Super Hornet production line going, which from a strategic standpoint isn't necessarily a bad thing, and if you own Boeing stock is a great thing. Now, this brings us to kind of the assumed battlefields of the future, and I've got General Mike Minahan here. If you've watched that video, you know. But he was kind of recently, like last year or so, one of the biggest proponents that, hey, we're going to war with China soon. And I think his estimate was like 2025, oddly enough. It's interesting that the Boeing production line ends in 2025. This guy's like, hey, 2025 is when we're going to war. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he sees China as the biggest threat. And he had this whole memo that got leaked that was absurd. But basically, the battleground of the future is the Pacific in his mind. But there's also concerns in Europe, and then, of course, we just may not know, because that's kind of the way things go most of the time. But if we look at the Pacific, there are three main regions that we'd really look at seeing combat. So you have the South China Sea. That's always been kind of a hotly contested area with at least the modern variation here of the CCP. They have pretty much consistently ongoing disputes with every country you see in that picture, but they have a lot of run-ins from a naval perspective with the Philippines. The U.S. Navy, of course, transits this area a lot, so there's a lot of tension there. There's a lot of contested areas, waterways, all of that. So very likely would see that. Now, of course, you notice, well, there's a lot of small islands here. This is a patch of water. This is a naval fight. And if we, as much as, this would be a very different conflict, going to war in the Pacific means you're largely a naval force, right? Looking back to World War II, at least. And then you have Taiwan, of course, which is probably the most hot button, like, land-based area you would kind of expect. But once again, close air support would be a pretty important factor here. Any of these three, especially if it's, the Korea's maybe a little different, but realistically, China being involved in all three of these, airspace is going to be contested. CAS missions are going to be very difficult to fly. And kind of to his benefit, to Bert Brown's benefit in this article, if you were looking at Taiwan, your close air support's probably coming off an aircraft carrier. Right. You do have some aircraft that are flying either from Guam or the Philippines or Japan, but generally speaking, you're probably, especially in a contested area, going to look at aircraft carrier-based stuff. So most of your Super Hornets or F-35s coming off of carriers are probably looking at doing that type of mission, if not just air superiority, because once again, contested airspace. You just can't say that enough in all of these contexts. And then the Korean Peninsula. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat that whether or not China actually jumped in on this, they probably would, but they've also been really hesitant with North Korea and kind of their modern, last, say, 10 years or so. So, yeah, that could be a little different. You're probably looking at more your traditional close air support roles here. You have a lot more established USAF air bases in the area. So, less of a US Navy situation, but they would still be playing a pretty big part here. Now, Europe's a little different, obviously, because you're going to have a lot more USAF assets available. So, there's a lot more air bases you can operate from, plus other countries. So, if you're looking at using Super Hornets for your kind of CAS missions, sure, yeah. I think the biggest contention you're going to have, and we've seen this with Ukraine, but of course Ukraine has been limited in terms of hardware and stuff like that. The Russian Air Force, while it does have a fairly large number of aircraft, it hasn't been like massively active. Like, it's been a lot of drone and cruise missile attacks, largely because of integrated air defense systems. And that's been on both sides of the border. So that's something that we'd have to contend with. But of course, if the USAF did adopt some of those Growler squadrons from the US Navy, that can kind of help a little bit. Using tasking from a variety of other, data-linked aircraft like F-35, you could still use Hornets here, Super Hornets here. And of course, they're much stealthier than like regular Hornets, but it's just one of those things that still contested airspace to a degree, and what we've kind of seen success Ukraine-wise has been like super low flying, and that, but once again, also very different. Like the Super Hornet's not going to be making gun runs, right? It's going to be using guided munitions from a distance, like pretty much the rest of the USAF does whenever they do these types of missions. So, take it or leave it here. I think that the Pacific's a little different, obviously, because there's a lot more naval play here, but generally, while the Navy wouldn't be excluded from this type of situation, this is much more USAF, and having more established USAF squadrons and air bases in the area, you're probably looking at F-16, F-15 type situations. And that brings us to the unknown battlefields of the future, like Iraq and Afghanistan. The US had been preparing for a war in Europe since the end of World War II, basically, and slightly relaxed that when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, they weren't fighting full-on war, but you still did have some conflicts in, like, the Baltics and stuff like that. So, you still technically had a war in Europe, just not the same kind you were expecting. However, we did have full deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, which were not something we were prepared for. So, once again, understanding of how we operated as a military, how we were structured, and how we approached our air missions changed, right? So, the A-10 was still useful, but in a very different way, right? It wasn't tank busting missions that this thing was going on. It was like soft targets, right? It's close air support for boots on the ground against insurgents in a building or something. Now, there's some problems with that, and it is what it is, but generally, for the most part, guided munitions kind of do the same thing and are, to an extent, safer for at least the boots on the ground. So, this is one of those situations where I'm sure, depending on the battlefield, things would change, but guided munitions do kind of make this a little bit less of a, hey, we need to find a role for this thing, right? It's like, okay, guided munitions kind of work from a distance. Unless the terrain is just ridiculous, we should be able to use them kind of around the world. Which brings me to the idea of other replacements, because the A-10 is on its way out. It's been... The U.S. Air Force has been trying to retire it for a long time, and Congress just won't do it for a variety of valid and confusing reasons. But one thing from a very small quantity that has replaced the A-10 is the Skywarden. The air tractor here. It, for special operations, has replaced the A-10. Now, I don't know that you could really do this in widespread mass use, but it is an option for maybe certain mission sets or certain regions. And then something, he kind of mentions in the article is that F-16s and F-15s already do these mission sets. Like, they just use guided munitions from a distance. But his kind of argument against that is like, yeah, they can already do these close air support missions, but they don't have the Forward Air Controller Airborne guys there. And they're already stretched thin doing other missions. That's kind of the downside you have to an extent with multi-role aircraft, is that not only is the aircraft a jack of all trades but master of none, but your pilots, from a kind of necessity standpoint, have to be the same way. So they're going to be stretched thin. Even if they're really only tasked on one mission set, they're trained on others and usually end up kind of filling gaps where they can. And then, of course, you have the F-35A as well. So you have options, right? 3 of the 4 already exist in a fairly sizable number and do this mission, with the last, the Sky Warden, being already like doing this mission but just in much smaller quantities, or in smaller sample sizes, we'll say, since it's only for special operations. Now, what replaces the A-10, in my opinion, in the most realistic sense? It's going to be the existing USAF fleet. Instead of getting Super Hornets and bringing this whole new supply chain and all of that in, even though, it exists in the Navy, just because it exists in the Navy sphere doesn't necessarily mean it's easy to transfer over to the USAF. But, they have F-16Fs, F-15EXs on the way, F-35s in a variety of different configurations. I think pretty much for the Air Force, it's only the A version. But they would probably just order more, like if they really needed it, but they'll probably just use what they have. If things were to even come to a head, right? All of these aircraft effectively use the same type of munitions. All of the guided munitions the A-10 uses, these use too. Now, of course, you're missing out on unguided rockets and, of course, the big gun. But realistically, from a strategic standpoint, that's not really much difference in terms of getting this kind of mission done. And you probably have higher survivability rates for the pilots because they're not really going like really close in. Yeah, so instead of introducing something new, I think they would probably be more lenient towards the idea of doing just what they have and just expanding what they have or something like that. So realistically, that's probably where this ends. But who knows? Maybe we'll see Super Hornets in USAF use, whether it's the Growlers or just keeping that Boeing production line open. We don't know, but let me know in the comments what you think. Is this a good idea? Is this not a good idea? Is it wild? Is it too out there? Who knows? But also be able to go check the community tab because I'm posting polls about this type of stuff as well. So be sure to participate in that, and I'll recap those at the end of the month. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me, guys. I'll see you in the next one.